What's A Midsummer Night's Dream really about, according to Pantaloon? Most commentators on A Midsummer Night's Dream say that it's about the irrationality of love. And I agree with them, but I think it goes considerably further than that. Love isn't generally presented in the play at all romantically. On the contrary, Theseus defines his relationship with Hippolyta in terms of force and male dominance. I wooed thee with my sword, and won thy love doing thee injuries. And although he confidently refers to thy love, he only refers to his own desires. Then Aegeus also asserts male dominance when he asks the Duke to force Hermia into an arranged marriage with Demetrius, announcing, "He hath my love," whereas his unhappy daughter is clearly being shown none. Similarly, Demetrius doesn't take the opportunity to express any love for her, only demanding his right. And even the law of the land is anti-romantic, providing the death penalty if Hermia refuses her father's choice of a husband for her. The fairies are no better. Oberon insists on his dominance. "Am not I thy lord?" unjustifiably demanding possession of the little boy that Titania has adopted. When she refuses, he's so incensed that he immediately determines to take his revenge, "till I torment thee for this injury." He coldly plots to regain unchallenged power by drugging her, and then savagely and horrifically getting her to commit bestiality with lion, bear, or wolf, or bull, or meddling monkey, or on busy ape. He shows no love towards his wife, only sadistic relish at her degradation, and his eventual subjugation of her is celebrated with more sadism. "When I had at my pleasure taunted her." None of these relationships exhibit mutual love. Instead, they are tainted by accusations of infidelity. Titania accuses Oberon of adultery with amorous Phillida, and also with Hippolyta, "your warrior love." Oberon, meanwhile, alleges that Titania is promiscuous, wanton, and accuses her of love to Theseus. And then he accuses Theseus of serial betrayal, of Perigenia, Eagles, Ariadne, and Antiopa. Furthermore, Demetrius is called this spotted and inconstant man because he won Helena's heart and then abandoned her to pursue Hermia. The only example of conventional romance is that of Lysander and Hermia. But even when Hermia swears to keep faith with Lysander, she worryingly includes references to infidelity. "By all the vows that ever men have broke," while Lysander acknowledges that love often doesn't last long. "Momentary as a sound, swift as a shadow, short as any dream." So we find that all the male-female relationships are being depicted in distinctly unsettling ways, even before we consider the idea that we now come to, that falling in love is shown to be totally irrational and unreliable and absurd. But a play is not just a series of ideas, like an academic treatise. It's an experience involving not only our intellect, but our emotions and our psychology. It includes sights and sounds and feelings. So only when we react to a performance can we really assess how falling in love is portrayed. Does it seem disturbingly demented or threatening, endangering the protagonist's happiness and even their lives? Or are we given a comic view in which infatuation is just very funny, and we feel confident that everyone will survive, physically and emotionally? Well, in my experience, when the play is performed by experts in comedy in a theatre, it is hilarious. So, how does Shakespeare manage this? I'll try to tell you. By the end of the first scene, the gloomy atmosphere is already lightening. Whereas in the tragedy Romeo and Juliet, parental opposition spells disaster for the lovers, in the comedy A Midsummer Night's Dream, the couple simply decide to elope and so provide the possibility of a happy ending. And this is when the irrationality of infatuation is first clearly stated in Helena's soliloquy, which proclaims that when people fall in love, their judgment cannot be trusted. Nor hath love's mind of any judgment taste. The lovesick girl is now alone on the stage, directly addressing the audience, a theatrical device which often creates an intimate relationship between the character and the playgoers as she opens her heart to them. But this is not a moving speech which wins the audience's undiluted sympathy. The sentiments are clichés, the language is unsophisticated, and the rhyming couplets emphasize the predictability and unvaryingly simple structure of her platitudes. Moreover, she condemns herself by criticizing Demetrius for his obsession. He errs, doting on Hermia's eyes, while blithely admitting her own identical fixation. So I, admiring of his qualities. This means that she's not just analyzing irrational infatuation, she's exhibiting it. And the irony of this tends to make an audience begin to see her as comic. Then she adds more absurdity by announcing that love can transform things base and vile. But it sounds ironically as if she's describing Demetrius, whom she actually worships. And the irony continues when, after offering this rational philosophizing, she proves herself quite incapable of benefiting from it. On the contrary, she determines to intensify her pursuit of Demetrius. She now appears less the tragic victim and more the obsessive stalker. This seeming madness alienates an audience's sympathy, and then she excludes herself further from our affection by her apparently masochistic wish to enrich my pain. Finally, her casual betrayal of her best friend's hopes of happiness by telling Demetrius about Hermia's escape plan tends to produce a shocked intake of breath from the audience, rather than an opening of their hearts to her. She's not tragic, merely ridiculous and distinctly weird. So Shakespeare is continuing the shift in tone to comedy. The comic atmosphere is then fully achieved in the next scene, with a bunch of incompetent amateur actors attempting to mount a tragedy which is similar to Romeo and Juliet, but which will clearly become farcical. They even ludicrously title it A Most Lamentable Comedy. This is reassuring because we feel that if Shakespeare is burlesquing tragedy, then he cannot be creating it. So Lysander and Hermia may achieve the happy ending that we expect in comedy, and the lover's infatuation will seem funny rather than prove fatal. I think I need to mention here a problem with the use of the word love. We hear it nowadays used in different contexts and in different senses, but in this play it usually refers to what we call falling in love. Some modern psychologists use the term limerence to describe this state, which is psychological, emotional, and physical. But perhaps it might be easier if I use the word infatuation. When Helena says that Demetrius is doting on Hermia and describes the effect of love at some length, she's clearly talking about infatuation. And when I discuss the irrationality of love, I'm also referring to infatuation. By pursuing Demetrius to the wood, Helena clearly shows herself to be infatuated. But when he says, "I do not, no, I cannot love you," and she replies, "And even for that do I love you the more," she's again exhibiting the crazy obsession of the stalker. And as if this isn't enough, she seems even more absurd and disturbing when she degrades herself masochistically. "I am your spaniel. The more you beat me, I will fawn on you. Spurn me, strike me," asking to be used as you use your dog. Actresses playing the part often illustrate this by dropping onto all fours, which may seem rather shocking, but the audience still usually laugh, treating the grotesque situation as ridiculous. When he tries to repel her by declaring nastily, "I am sick when I do look on thee," she glibly responds, "And I am sick when I look not on you." Her apparent invulnerability to rejection seems to give her the ability to endlessly bounce back like a cartoon character. Even when he threatens to rape her, saying she's risking the rich worth of your virginity, she remains comically impervious, trusting his virtue. Her idiotic inability to feel fear leaves the aspirant rapist absurdly impotent. Comedy springs here from the inversion of the normal balance of power. Not only does the man fail to physically intimidate the woman and force her to run away, but he's even reduced to running away from her. And she underlines the paradox. "The mild hind makes speed to catch the tiger." The comic tone is also achieved by the diction, which is so simple as to sound juvenile, and by the constant leaping between emotional extremes: love, hatred, heaven, hell, woo, fight. The audience cannot adapt to these rapid changes, and so they laugh at the preposterous melodrama. Some playgoers think that Helena's behavior goes beyond irrationality and become concerned for her mental health. But her self-dramatizing exit line, "To die upon the hand I love so well," continues to portray her as a comic caricature. I keep referring to the audience reaction because it's the real measure of response. When the play is performed in a theatre, the question, "Does the writer make infatuation seem comic?" is answered definitively by the audience's spontaneous laughter. The irrationality of infatuation is indicated by the frequent mention in the play of the unreliability of our eyes, which seriously malfunction in the lover's perception of the love object. Helena mentions Cupid painted blind, and ironically, the malfunction occurs when the lover is hypnotized by someone else's blessed and attractive eyes. Helena has already warned us that love looks not with the eyes, but with the mind, meaning that falling in love involves manufacturing a romantic illusion. This daydream is a fantasy created by our wishes and is similar to our night dreams. When Hermia goes to sleep, she refers to the wisher's eyes. What happens to the quartet of lovers during the night is an illustration of how people fall in and out of love, certain of their perceptions, but quite blind to reality. In a similar way, when we dream at night, our eyes are closed, but we think that the creations of our imagination can be seen clearly. In the modern world, we still recognize this behavior and continue to use the terminology of sight. What does she see in him? I must have been blind. My eyes have been opened. In the play, it is of course the eyes to which the love juice is applied, making the lover's perceptions more unreliable and their protestations more hilarious. A big laugh comes when Lysander wakes and immediately falls in love with Helena, especially when we remember that he went to sleep uttering the words, "End life when I end loyalty." Again, his passion is so extreme, "And run through fire I will for thy sweet sake," and instantaneous, that the audience cannot adjust emotionally and sympathize, but can only treat the situation as wildly comic. He's further mocked by the irony of his own justification. Reason says you are the worthier maid, when he's in fact being totally unreasonable. An unsettling shadow is cast when he declares his newfound loathing for Hermia, but we recognize the adolescent ricocheting between love and hatred, and his exit is reassuringly comic as he ludicrously adopts the stereotypical romantic role. To honor Helen and to be her knight. But once again, Shakespeare mixes the serious and the amusing. Hermia wakes from a literal nightmare, as if she senses Lysander's loathing. "Methought a serpent ate my heart away, and you sat smiling at his cruel prey," and discovers that he has abandoned her. However, she throws herself into more passionate excess. "Either death or you I'll find immediately," which is similar to Helena's previous histrionics, and so again lurches towards comic melodrama. Meanwhile, the constant switches in tone and the brevity of the dramatic episodes, interrupted by rapid exits, prevent the audience becoming emotionally involved, as tragedy would demand. Helena continues with the same hot-blooded verbal extravagance when she accuses Demetrius. "If thou hast slain Lysander in his sleep, being o'er shoes in blood, plunge in the deep and kill me too." But this grand gesture often collapses into bathos. Many productions take Hermia's unfinished line of verse as the writer's indication that she should melodramatically offer her breast to the slaughter, and then this pose is undercut when Demetrius comically drools at the sight. Any potential tragedy is banished when we see that Hermia's emotional survival is assured. 1 second she's pleading for Demetrius's help, but the next she erupts in daunting aggression. When she abuses him, out dog, out cur, the actress playing Hermia may instinctively feel that each explosive insult should be accompanied by the comic paradox of the apparently defenseless woman hitting the stronger man. The next time the lovers return to the stage, the audience are similarly distanced from their adolescent emotional turmoil. We must concentrate fully in order to follow the complications of the misunderstandings and to keep up with the four-cornered slanging match. So again, we don't have time to feel sympathy towards any one character. We simply enjoy the passionate fireworks. When Lysander and Demetrius both reject Hermia, it could lead to heartbreak, which would make infatuation seem a serious subject with potentially tragic consequences. But the scene degenerates into juvenile name-calling. Thou cat! Tawny Tartar! You puppet! You painted maypole! Reassuringly, there is again no real violence. In fact, in another comic inversion of the conventional male advantage in Trials of Strength, when Hermia wraps herself round Lysander, the man is unable to shake her off. Although the men threaten sword play, it comes to nothing, and instead there is only an attempted cat fight. And this contains another comic inversion when we see the taller Helena frightened by the shorter Hermia's attack. The physical and verbal chaos has the speed, noise, and emotional volatility of farce, the dramatic form in which escalating hysteria makes us laugh rather than feel sympathy. And we are secure in the knowledge that it's all been caused by mistaken identity when Puck dosed the wrong mortal. So the comic conventions apply. Infatuation is portrayed as ludicrous and deranged, but in a performance of this play, it provides riotous entertainment. Furthermore, we know that the preposterous hostility is only caused by the drug, so the fairies will be able to restore order. Ultimately, any temporary emotional damage will evaporate. Puck promises, Jack shall have Jill, and all shall be well. This again reflects the central truth about a theatrical comedy, that its effect can only be judged in performance. We need to see the characters dashing on and off stage farcically, pulling horrified faces, becoming physically threatening, then dissolving into impotence, adopting absurd poses, hurling themselves from an ecstatic peak into a pseudo-tragic abyss, and showing the endless energy of squabbling adolescence. We need to listen to the juvenile, unsophisticated diction, the weakness of the clichés, and the comedic buoyancy of the rhyming couplets, and hear all the preposterous shouting, screaming, and wailing. We need to feel our lack of empathy for the male lovers because they're stereotyped. Lysander is the good guy and Demetrius is the bad guy. And although the girls are differentiated, Helena's grovelling, contrasting with Hermia's violence, their names are so similar that when they are confusingly swapped as objects of the men's affections, we sometimes find ourselves relying on identifying them on stage by their comic physical difference. Helena is tall and fair, Hermia is short and dark. It is difficult to take seriously characters who are so shallow and who are so continually controlled by events that they become little more than puppets for Puck to play with. And when we witness his mockery of ludicrous humans, Lord, what fools these mortals be, we discover that we are chuckling in agreement. Most of all, we need to experience Titania's first encounter with Bottom. A theatre audience is confronted by the grotesque sight of a beast's head planted on a human body, and its anomalous contrast with the fairy queen's supernatural beauty. Having earlier been enchanted by the sweet singing of Titania's lullaby, the audience now has its ears assaulted by Bottom's strident braying and bursts into laughter at her response to the cacophony. What angel wakes me from my flowery bed? Despite many modern directors making the undertones of bestiality all too graphic, the script makes it quite clear that Bottom does not immediately become a rampant stud. He remains philosophically objective. Reason and love keep little company together nowadays, and comically unresponsive to her advances. In fact, she has to prevent him leaving. Unlike the assertive men in the opening scene, he is subject to the female's control. The inversion of power is as funny as Helena's pursuit of Demetrius. And when Titania pities enforced chastity, we see that it is the man who is being dragged to bed. Meanwhile, he seems comically more interested in chatting to the other fairies than in copulation. When she commands, "Tie up my lover's tongue," it is another indication that the audience are listening to the beast's deafening din, which may be trumpeting the donkey's sexual reputation, but is also reminding us of its stereotypical stupidity, and thus encourages a comic effect. Even when they wake from their post-coital slumber, her sexual innuendos, like "fetch thee new nuts," seem to leave him amusingly unaroused. "I'd rather have a handful of two of dried peas." Although the bestiality has been engineered by Oberon, Titania is not a weeping victim, but has apparently achieved sexual gratification. The female ivy so enrings the barky fingers of the elm. It is, I think, an extraordinary, complex, and emotionally confusing situation. But as ever, the real test is an audience's response, which may vary from one production to another, and even from one performance to another. And although laughter is infectious, sometimes not all the members of an audience react in the same way. However, Bottom's blithe acceptance of the bizarre situation and his passivity despite the physical delights on offer usually mean that their incongruous pairing provokes hilarity. All of this, I hope, explains my opening suggestion that in this play, Shakespeare is examining the irrationality of infatuation, and that he portrays it as resulting in behavior which seems demented but can be very amusing. That's the end of the first half. There will now be a 1-minute interval.
Moonlight becomes you. It goes with your hair. You certainly know the right thing to wear. Moonlight becomes you. I'm thrilled at the sight. I could get so romantic tonight. You're all dressed up to go dreaming. Now don't tell me I'm wrong. And what a night to go dreaming. Mind if I tag along? If I say I love you, I want you to know it's not just because there's moonlight, although moonlight becomes you so.
So now I think I can begin to examine my other suggestion that this subject is connected to a wider theme. Act 5 opens with Theseus again dismissing infatuation as irrational. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains. But then he adds another category. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. Since playwrights were called poets, Shakespeare is including himself in the company of the deranged. He's not using this play to mock irrational behavior in human beings as if they were an inferior species, as Puck does. What fools these mortals be! On the contrary, he acknowledges that, as a playwright and an actor, he's also a man whose imagination is so powerful that at times it may seem like madness. The poet sigh in a fine frenzy rolling. Theseus again advocates rationality when he expresses skepticism about folk superstitions. More strange than true, I never may believe these antique fables, nor these fairy toys. He brackets such traditions with the delusions of lovers and madmen, and suggests that beliefs in the supernatural proceed from faulty logic. Such tricks hath strong imagination, that if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. He asserts that overwhelming emotion can interfere with our rational processes. Or in the night, imagining some fear, how easy is a bush supposed a bear. Steadfastly, he puts his faith in cool reason to explain the source of shaping fantasies. Hippolyta, however, insists that the lover's account of events cannot be dismissed as fantasy. Their joint testimony more witnesseth than fancy's images. But unfortunately, we are aware that the lovers have amply demonstrated that their grasp on reality is shaky, so they are not the most reliable witnesses. Perhaps some naive individuals in the original audience might have thought that since they had seen the fairies on stage, that proved their existence. But of course, the majority knew that the figures they perceived were only actors pretending to be supernatural. However, most members of Elizabethan society did believe in fairies, or in some other mythical creatures. So, is Shakespeare extending the play's major theme of imagination's power over rationality to include its function in the creation of traditional beliefs about the supernatural? Does an audience's perception of fairies on stage, and then the realization that it is only an illusion, suggest that all credence in the paranormal might stem from flawed reasoning? The playwright does not extend the skepticism about the existence of fairies further into the realm of religious beliefs. But then you wouldn't expect him to. At his times, public questioning of church doctrine could get you burnt at the stake. He only tells us that the poet's eye doth glance from heaven to from earth to heaven, and that his imagination creates shapes out of airy nothing. Perhaps nowadays some members of a modern secular audience might think that the writer is hinting as far as he dare, and they might feel now free to follow the idea through. They might consider the thought processes involved in religious beliefs, and they might glance from heaven to from earth to heaven. While we are considering these differing perceptions of reality, we may remember that the play's title, surprisingly, promises a dream, like the nightly triumph of imagination over everyday consciousness. But the title is ambiguous. Does it refer to Bottom's dream? I have had a most rare vision. I have had a dream. Or Titania's dream. What visions have I seen? Or Hermia's dream. What a dream was here. Or the drug-induced romantic fantasies of Lysander and Demetrius when they fall in love with Helena. Or even the mental aberrations of Helena when she stalks Demetrius. Is it even possible that the whole play is being defined as a dream? A fiction proposed by the writer, which can only seem real if the audience helps to create the illusion. So perhaps we now make the thematic connection. Not only are the lover and the poet in the grip of a fantasy, but so are all of us when we sleep and dream. And if the play is to work in performance, the audience must also allow themselves to dream while they are awake, to lose their hold on reality and be overwhelmed by fantasy. Theatre is an imaginative collaboration between writer, actors, and audience. Maybe we now realize that the problems facing Bottom's amateur actors when creating their fiction are analogous to those encountered by Shakespeare and his company. A major concern at their rehearsal is how to bring moonlight into a chamber. And this, of course, is the problem faced by the playwright himself, since much of his play is set at night in moonlight. The amateur's solution is clumsily literal. Doth the moon shine that night? Whereas the professional writer relies on poetry to evoke the lighting. Ill met by moonlight. The tradesman's alternative suggestion that someone present the person of moonshine may seem uninspired, but at least it is theatrical. And it's not all that far removed from Shakespeare's reliance on actors to present the persons of fairies. Another challenge comes for the playwright with the representation of a large wood on the stage. But he simply repeatedly mentions the wood, the night, and the moonlight, and leaves it to the audience's imagination to transform an open-air stage in the afternoon daylight into its complete opposite. However, another technique is also used to suggest the changes of location. We hear changes in the sound of speech. In the first scene, the Duke's palace is implied by the conventional dignity of blank verse. Then, when the lovers are out of his presence, they transition into lighter rhyming couplets. Then the tradesmen's socially inferior surroundings are assumed from their use of common prose. And finally, a fairy indicates the transformation to the wood at night by moonlight and into the supernatural. Over hill, over dale, thorough bush, thorough briar, over park, over pale, thorough flood, thorough fire, I do wander everywhere. It's a complete change of tone. These are not the conventional 5-beat lines, and this is not the usual iambic rhythm. Instead, we're given a more primitive rhythm, tied by simple rhymes. It begins like the bouncy verse of childhood, over hill, over dale. But as the atmosphere darkens, thorough flood, thorough fire, it develops the sound of magic, like the witch's incantation in Macbeth. Fair is foul, and foul is fair. Then the fairy's speech modulates back to childish simplicity. And I serve the fairy queen to dew her orbs upon the green. And yet Puck's response again changes the tone. The king doth keep his revels here tonight. Take heed the queen come not within his sight. The seriousness of royal marital conflict means a return to the 5-beat lines which earlier reflected Theseus's power. But the rhythm is reassuringly regular, and again we hear musical rhyme, so this sounds more like a disagreement rather than a real war. However, the rhymes disappear when Oberon and Titania exchange bitter accusations of infidelity. This is not for children's ears. And the rhythm fluctuates when she creates powerful images of disruption in nature. The seasons alter. Hoary-headed frosts fall in the fresh lap of the crimson rose, and on old Hiam's thin and icy crown an odorous chaplet of sweet summer buds is as in mockery set. There is chaos throughout the world, but like the setting, it is not represented by bits of scenery or special effects. It is created by the writer's poetry and the audience's imagination. Shakespeare enjoys playing games with the fictions produced by theatrical conventions. With breathtaking audacity, he gives Quince the line, "This green plot shall be our stage." So the professional actor playing the part of Quince is standing on the stage, pointing at the floorboards and informing the audience that they have to imagine that he's standing on an expanse of grass. And then the character, Quince, demands that the other amateur actors imagine that the grass is a stage. Moreover, Quince continues, "This hawthorn brake shall be our tiring house." And so the professional actor playing Quince is pointing at the theatre's dressing room, their tiring house, and telling the audience to imagine it is a bush, while the character Quince tells his fellow amateur actors to imagine that the bush is a dressing room. The audience have to perform more imaginative gymnastics when Titania mentions that the fairies in her train are so tiny that they can war with rear mice for their leathern wings to make my small elves coats. Although Oberon and Titania are thought of as human-sized, especially if she is to copulate with Bottom, their followers are apparently to be regarded as no bigger than a woodland creature. And there the snake throws her enamelled skin, weed wide enough to wrap a fairy in. On the Elizabethan stage, the fairies were played by small boys. Bottom addresses them as Monsieur or Master. But obviously, they would still appear gigantic compared with a snake skin. Once again, the author is quite deliberately describing physical details which are at total variance with what we see on stage, and challenging the audience to create a mental picture. With similar insouciance, Shakespeare solves the problem of Oberon's invisibility to mortals by the character addressing the audience directly and boldly informing them, "I am invisible." We are thus invited to join in the game of make-believe. We know that the cast are all males, but some of them are pretending to be females, and we accept this. We know that the people on stage are only pretending that they can't see us, although it's broad daylight, and we support the pretense. We know that they are all actors who are already pretending that some are gentlefolk and some are tradesmen, and even that one is the king of the fairies. So now, it shouldn't be too much of a stretch to imagine that he is invisible, especially when it's all such fun, and Oberon is joining the audience in laughing at the absurd antics of the lovers. The author doesn't even feel the need to present the invisibility as fairy magic, produced by the chanting of a spell, nor does he invest it with the mystery of Shakespearean poetry. In fact, the simplicity and brevity of expression makes it almost prosaic. It is as if the actor suddenly throws a ball to the audience, who instinctively catch it. But before they have time to reflect on the trick, their attention is distracted by Demetrius and Helena running on and bursting into an altercation. Then Oberon is immediately reacting to their noisy passions, and thus demonstrating his invisibility. By slick sleight of hand, the magic trick has been performed. Next, we see the tradesmen's concerns about the possible response to their theatrical presentation of a lion. They fear that their audience might confuse their incompetent performance with reality, but Shakespeare has no such worries. Indeed, within minutes of the debate, he confronts his audience with a man who has a donkey's head. But since Bottom seems completely unaware that there is any problem, and even starts cheerfully singing, the audience enjoy the novelty of the situation. Then they rejoice at the unique spectacle of an actor dressed as the Queen of the Fairies falling in love with an actor wearing an ass's head. It's so extraordinary and so hilarious, with such strange undertones, that no one considers reality. We enter Shakespeare's imaginative vision, the poet's dream. Another theatrical game is played with the audience when Oberon instructs Puck, "Overcast the night with drooping fog." But unfortunately, we find many modern productions flooding the stage with dry ice and creating wonderful lighting effects and entirely sabotaging the writer's intentions. Like Oberon's earlier invisibility, the whole point is that there are no special effects. The audience get to enjoy the actors pretending that they're enveloped in thick fog and pretending that they can't see each other. And again, the audience colludes in the game, also pretending that the actors are lost in fog, and then rejoices in this triumph of the imagination, which is shared equally between actors and audience. But if you obscure the actors by using modern smoke machines or dry ice, then you deprive everybody of the opportunity to create the illusion in their own mind, to dream their own dream. You destroy the link which this play explores between the psychological state of falling in love and the experience of our nightly dreaming, and also the daydreaming that the theatre creates. When Bottom wakes alone in the wood, he addresses the audience in wonder. "I have had a dream past the wit of man to say what dream it was." And their response is not just to sympathize with him, but to empathize. For when they leave the theatre, they can echo his words. "I have had a dream." Shakespeare could have ended his play at the close of Act 4, Scene 1. The comic chaos of the night has been ended, and 3 marriages are promised, while Oberon and Titania's reconciliation is marked by a dance. But Act 5 allows Theseus to connect the lunatic, the lover, and the poet by their mental transformation. Such tricks hath strong imagination. Whereupon all the married characters are challenged to use their imaginations to make up for the deficiencies of the amateur actors. The best in this kind are but shadows, and the worst are no worse if imagination amend them. Bottom's audience have to be as collaborative as Shakespeare's audience. Of course, the tradesman's performance is uproariously inept, and once again you have to enjoy an expert production in a theatre to realize that. But nevertheless, Hippolyta still manages to respond to the attempts at tragedy. "Beshrew my heart, but I pity the man." And sometimes theatre audiences react similarly, responding to Thisbe's death with a surprisingly poignant silence. For a moment their belly laughs cease, and their imagination does amend the tradesman's weaknesses. Bottom, however, is aware of no such weaknesses. He has always been totally overpowered by the strength of his imagination. When we first saw him in Act 1, he desperately wanted to play every role that was mentioned, not because he was ruthlessly egotistical, but because he was captivated by enthusiasm and immediately felt himself mentally transformed into a woman or a lion. So when he's later physically transformed into an ass and attracts the Queen of the Fairies, he takes it all in his stride. For the imaginative man, reality is infinitely mutable. In the same way that he unselfconsciously talks to Queen Titania and her fairies, he casually contradicts Duke Theseus in Act 5, reassuring him confidently, "You shall see it will fall pat as I told you." He's able to switch easily between playing the part of the tragic hero, Pyramus, and chatting informally to the audience. Although he does not have the necessary technique or understand contemporary dramatic conventions, He is a real man of the theatre. And so the title of A Midsummer Night's Dream means much more to us at the end of a performance, and Puck emphasizes its significance in a direct address to the audience. He begins, "If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended." And we realize that he's echoing Theseus's critique of the amateur actors. The best in this kind are but shadows, and the worst no worse if imagination amend them. Puck is asking for the same kind of imaginative participation from his audience that Theseus demanded from Hippolyta, and the fairy repeatedly echoes the Duke. "We will mend, we will make amends, Robin shall restore amends." Then he specifically refers to the play's title. "Think that you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear, and this weak and idle theme no more yielding but a dream." Although the play has demonstrated the irrationality of infatuation, it has shown it as no more than the product of a fevered imagination. And Shakespeare reminds us that for the play, his dream, to achieve success at that very performance, the playgoer's reason must also be subordinated to their imagination, as it always is when we dream. In that final speech, Puck is mutating into the actor who plays the part, no longer pretending that he can't see the audience, but acknowledging their presence and assisting them to wake up from the theatrical dream and open their eyes to everyday reality. To sum up, my answer to the question, what is A Midsummer Night's Dream really about, is it's about the way that by exercising our human imagination, we can transform reality into fantasy. People exhibiting the most extreme and uncontrolled form of this behavior were called by the Elizabethans lunatics. Individuals with a less acute psychological alteration are nowadays said to have fallen in love, which is a mental state that many people are desperate to achieve. Then there are writers like Shakespeare, who become at times almost possessed by their extraordinary artistic visions and temporarily blind to their surroundings. And then there are the majority of human beings who may not believe specifically in fairies, but still accept the existence of some form of the supernatural, and do not always accept the rule of reason. Finally, there are all of us in the theatre's audience who are required by the actors to willingly participate in a communal flight of the imagination, with, as Hippolyta says, all their minds transfigured so together. So we all find our position somewhere within the spectrum, and then at night we all go to sleep, and for every one of us, fantasy takes over from reality. We close our eyes, and the drama begins. We can all be the victims of our imagination, but we can also be the beneficiaries. Good night. Sweet dreams.